All right, welcome to our study. This PowerPoint presentation is based upon this book that you see on the slide here, titled The Interpretative Journey. It's really helpful, especially as you're considering the study of the Old Testament and the New. That is, you're going from one covenant to another. You're going from one historical setting to another. And not only in that way, but also in regard to just studying the New Testament. This book has proven to be very useful, very beneficial to me. And I'd like for you to see it as well. Um, let's go to the next slide. And here's some excellent graphics that show the situation that we're dealing with. And that is, here's a city number one on the left side, and then here's one on the right-hand side, and you see that square under number 4, it has you are here. So we're over here in the new city, in the new covenant, and yet we're reading material that dates back to the 1st century in regard to the New Testament, and dates even further back to the nation of Israel and beyond in the Old Testament. So here's the setup. And it has to do with interpreting Scripture. It has to do with understanding it. But you see the river that separates them. And what separates them, as written in the flow of the water here, is culture, language, time, situation, and covenant. And again, we have two major covenants in the Bible. And we're not under the first one, we're under the second one. But even if you're considering the second one, how do you apply that one to us if you're reading something that applied to people in Corinth, for example, or under Roman culture? So this is a wonderful simplification here in this picture of how do you get from one side of the river to the other. And if you'll notice, there are 5 areas there, 5 circles enumerated for us. And number 1 is grasping the text in their town, whether it's 1st century material or before. And then number 2 is measuring the width of the river that you're going to cross. You got to cross over from the old to where we are today. And so you got to measure it. In other words, how far removed are we? In some cases, we aren't removed at all. It has a direct connection. There's no river, no barrier. And in other cases, there is serious barriers. And then number 3 is the principalizing bridge. In other words, you need a biblical principle, a universal principle that will help you cross over to where we are today in number 4, and then apply that to us in our situation, in our city. So I have found this useful, and I'll not go into detail with it because there's an entire textbook just on this subject, and it would be a course within itself. But I just want you to know that this is available, it's valuable, it's here. And whether you're studying Romans, Galatians, Revelation, it doesn't matter. You can use this material because they are principles behind interpreting and understanding Scripture. And so there it is, number 1. Step number 1 is grasping the text in their town. And the question is, what did the text mean to the biblical audience to whom it was written? And again, it doesn't matter what book of the New Testament or Old that you're reading. It applies, this applies to all. And now, completing step number one is to read the text carefully and make observations. Study the historical and literary context, and then synthesize the meaning of the passage for the biblical audience. That is, sum it up. Write down the particular points that will help you. And then number two is measuring the width of the river to cross. How far across is it? How difficult is it to manage? And that would include the differences between our day and theirs, between that biblical audience and ours. Does it have to do with language? And by the way, it does. And when you're studying the Bible, because it's written either in Hebrew for the Old Testament or a dialect of the Hebrew, the Aramaic, or in the New Testament, Greek. Remember that the Old Testament was translated in the 3rd century BC into Greek when the Greek Empire was fully underway. And so Greek scholars translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. So actually we have a Bible that is in one language, and that is the Greek language. And so knowing that one language, you can read any part of the Bible and have it in a common language. But even in doing that, you still have to bridge from Greek to our language. If you speak Spanish or Portuguese or English, you have to be able to bridge the language barrier, and that's a sizable one in and of itself. And then completing step number two, account for common differences, culture, language, situation, time, covenant. Focus on the unique differences found in a specific text. If you're studying an Old Testament passage, you must account for the life and work of Jesus Christ. What did he say about it? What changes are made as you go to the New Testament? And then number three, we discuss crossing the bridge. And you do that by principle, a biblical principle. And this is probably the most challenging part of this whole exercise. What is the theological principle in this text? Mistakes are made at this point repeatedly, even among seasoned Bible students. They will simply take a passage and say it means what it means. It means what it says. When there's more involved than that, much more involved than that. You have to decide what principle is there. Can you discern from the text that will help you to cross this river? And he says in completing step three, recall the differences identified in step two, identify similarities between the biblical audience and contemporary life today, and then holding the differences and similarities together, identify a broad theological principle. Write out the theological principle using present tense verbs. And so he's helping us to work through this methodically. In other words, don't assume, well, it means the same thing today as it did then. No. The language has changed, culture has changed, and even the covenant may have changed if you go from the old to the new. And here's a discussion of what he means by a theological principle. A theological principle should be reflected in the text. That is, don't make it up. Read it within the context of the book that you're studying. And number two, theological principle should be timeless and not tied to a specific situation. In other words, it needs to be a universal principle that fits no matter what covenant you live under. And number three, a theological principle should not be culturally bound. Um, this again is difficult even in itself. Um, Say, greet one another with a holy kiss. Well, our principle, our practice rather, where we live is to shake hands or to hug one another. But here it talks about a holy kiss. And you find it repeatedly in the New Testament letters. So that's a cultural exercise. And does it make any difference? Or are we bound to keep that culture, that cultural practice? Say, wearing a covering on your head for men or for women. Um, our dress, our code of dress, is it the same? Should it be the same as theirs? And then number four, a theological principle should correspond rather to the teaching of the rest of Scripture. And that is, it should harmonize with all of the Bible. So you should look outside of the text you're reading and to see if you're making something that contradicts itself somewhere else. It needs to harmonize. And then number five, a theological principle should be relevant to both the biblical and the contemporary audience. And so it should apply, and it should have meaning that you can discern between both that audience then, why they behave the way they did, and why we do. And then number four, consult the biblical map. And here's the question: how does our theological principle fit with the rest of the Bible? And so we're over here on the right side of that river now, but we still need to consider the whole Bible. Um, if in one place it says you are justified by works, as it does in James, and then in some places not of works, lest any man should boast, um, how do you harmonize those statements? We should not cause a conflict in the Bible by our misunderstanding. And by the way, that happens repeatedly. And it's easy to fall into that trap. So be sure that it fits with the rest of the Bible. And then completing step number four, does the principle correlate with the rest of the Bible? Either yes or no. And then secondly, if in the Old Testament, run your theological principle through the grid of the New Testament. And so you can see this is quite an exercise and an important one if you're going to interpret the Scriptures. And it is your and my responsibility to do that and to do it correctly. And then step number five is grasping the text in our own town. In other words, in our language, in our culture, in our practices, how do you apply it? How do you live out this theological principle or principles in our city? Well, again, this is just the framework for you to begin serious biblical studies. And I'm going to leave it here because this is really involved, but it sets up the framework for you to use it. I have used it. I constantly think about this picture, this graphic that you have here on this slide when I'm doing Bible studies. And don't don't think that this is overwhelming and that you can't do it. You learn how to do this as you study and as you make progress in your biblical studies. But accept the challenge to be an interpreter, because every Bible reader should be one. You are one. and you must do it thoughtfully and carefully, and be sure you don't contradict yourself or make a contradiction within Scripture. Completing the step number 5, apply the theological principle to specific situations in our contemporary culture, and there are numerous applicational possibilities because Christians today find themselves in a variety of situations. So it's not just one application that can be made. There are many. Well, I appreciate you for listening through and thinking through this. Maybe this is the first time you've had such a text as this one before you. I've presented this in churches before, in Bible classes, and I have found it very useful. And I hope it's been useful for you today. Thank you for listening.